Welcome, dear listener, to the quaint English village of St. Mary Mead, where hedgerows whisper with secrets, and the kettle is always just about to boil. Today, we bring you a tale of curiosity and cleverness, of snowbound streets and vanishing clues. Sit back by the fire, for this is Miss Marple and the vanishing footsteps in the snow. A Miss Marple story of wit, warmth, and a puzzle only the keenest eyes could solve. Chapter 1. A Curious Discovery. Expanded approximately 2,000 words. The snow had come in the night, silently and thoroughly, as if some heavenly housekeeper had set about dusting the village of St. Mary Mead with the whitest, finest flour. By morning, the hedgerows bent beneath the weight of it. Chimney pots wore little caps of white, and the narrow lanes that wound like ribbons between cottages lay soft and untrodden, as pure as a page before the first stroke of the pen. St. Mary Mead in winter was a picture postcard sort of place. The church spire rose neatly at its center, pointing toward a pale sky, washed with the hesitant light of January. The square, if such a haphazard collection of shops and houses could be called one, lay quiet beneath the snow. The grocer's with its bow windows, the post office with its ever-sticking door, the Blue Boar Inn with smoke curling from its chimney. All looked as though they had been tucked in for a long winter's nap, but the villagers themselves were, as ever, awake early. Milk needed fetching. Fires needed stoking, and gossip, like tea, was always best taken hot. Mrs. Beatrice Halloway, widow these 10 years and possessor of the sharpest tongue and keenest eyes in 3 counties, was the first to spot it. She had set out from her snug little house on High Street, a knitted shawl wrapped about her ample shoulders and a sturdy basket in hand. The milk cart had left its customary row of bottles outside the grocer's door, their caps peeking like little white berets through the snow. Mrs. Halloway's boots crunched as she crossed the square. Then she stopped dead. There, quite clearly imprinted in the smooth carpet of snow, she had already determined 3 things. First, the footprints must have been made after the snow stopped, else they would have filled in again. Second, they must have been made early, for she had been out not 5 minutes after 8. And third, she would most certainly tell everyone she met about them before the morning was out. Inside the grocer's, Mr. Pritchard was weighing out tea behind the counter. He was a thin man of mournful aspect, who regarded life as one long battle between commerce and weather, both usually unfavorable. "Morning, Mrs. Holloway," he said gloomily. "Beastly cold." Mrs. Holloway set down her basket and leaned across the counter with the air of one imparting tidings of national importance. "Mr. Pritchard, have you seen the footprints?" "Footprints?" "Leading across the square to the well, and then gone." Mr. Pritchard blinked. "Gone where?" "That's just it. Nowhere. They stopped dead, like the person melted into thin air." Mr. Pritchard sniffed. "Likely as not some young scamp hopped the wall." "In this weather? At that hour? Mark my words, Mr. Pritchard, there's more to it than that." And indeed there was, though neither could guess it yet. By 8:30, the story had spread as swiftly as news ever does in a village, by which is meant instantly and with embellishments. The blacksmith heard it from the baker's wife. The baker's wife heard it from the postmistress. The postmistress claimed she'd seen a strange light in the churchyard the night before, though this was later proved to be nothing more mysterious than the curate with a lantern after evening prayers. Still, the footprints were there. Anyone could see them, plain as day to the well. And then nothing. It was almost a relief when a second piece of news arrived to give the first some backbone. At 9 o'clock, the vicar himself appeared in the square, red-nosed and flustered, declaring that a silver locket belonging to platoons. And, through all this excitement, Miss Marple sat by her window at the far end of the high street, serenely knitting a scarf of pale blue wool. She had, of course, heard the news. One could hardly avoid it. The very air of the village seemed to hum with it. But Miss Marple believed in the economy of effort. Let others rush about in the cold, peering at footprints and offering theories. She would sit here in the warm a while longer, considering matters in her own fashion. For Miss Marple, though she seldom declared it outright, had an unshakable belief in the repetition of human nature. Change the century, the costume, the setting as you pleased. People, she maintained, remained the same. Somewhere in her long experience there would be a pattern to fit this puzzle, as neat as a stitch in her knitting. Still, even Miss Marple grew curious when young Simon Carter came hurrying down the lane from the schoolhouse, his thin face pink above his scarf. "They say the locket's been stolen," he announced to no one in particular. "And old Mrs. Holloway swears the thief vanished into thin air." Miss Marple regarded him mildly over her spectacles. "Vanished, Mr. Carter?" Simon flushed, as young men often did under Miss Marple's gaze. It wasn't that she looked at one sharply. Rather, she looked as though she saw through one, into all the places one would rather keep private. "Well, that's what they're saying," he muttered. "People," said Miss Marple gently, "say a great many things." He shifted, embarrassed, then blurted, "But where could he have gone, if the footprints stopped?" "Where indeed," said Miss Marple, and bent again over her knitting. But her eyes, if Simon had noticed, were very bright. By noon, the village had reached a consensus of sorts. The vicar, looking harassed, invited Colonel Pembroke, Mrs. Holloway, Simon Carter, Clara the housemaid, and Dr. Leonard Briggs to the vicarage. Winter's afternoon lay the answer. Miss Marple, casting on another row of pale blue stitches, meant to find it. Chapter 2. The Suspects Gather, approx. 2,000 words. The vicarage at St. Mary Mead was a tall, rather drafty building of mellow brick and ivy-covered walls, set just beyond the churchyard with its leaning headstones and yew trees black against the snow. Inside, the drawing room did its best to be welcoming. A brisk fire in the grate, the vicar's wife bustling about with tea trays and chairs drawn close together for warmth. Yet for all the firelight and steaming cups, there was a certain tension in the air, a stiffness, as though the very furniture knew that something out of the ordinary had happened, and disapproved of it heartily. Colonel Arthur Pembroke stood squarely on the hearthrug, a man constructed largely of straight lines, spine, legs, mustache, all bristling with authority. He had once commanded a regiment on the northwest frontier, and still carried himself as though expecting at any moment to be charged by tribesmen. Beside him, Mrs. Beatrice Holloway occupied the largest armchair with the air of a queen holding court. She was a solid woman, not so much fat as determinedly substantial, wrapped in layers of wool and propriety. Her voice, when she spoke, carried like a trumpet. Young Simon Carter sat on the edge of a chair near the window, his thin knees knocking together, spectacles fogged from the heat after his hurried walk from the schoolhouse. He had the anxious, slightly bewildered look of one who has misplaced something important, like his confidence, and isn't sure whether to admit it. Clara Whitfield, the vicarage housemaid, hovered near the door with a tray of cups. She was a tall, capable girl of about 25, with an expression of practical good sense and a faint air of having better things to do than witness village drama. Last came Dr. Leonard Briggs, a man in his 50s with a kindly face, a slightly rumpled air, and a tweed coat dusted with snowflakes. He was the sort of doctor who smelled faintly of pipe smoke and peppermint lozenges, and whose hands were perpetually ink-stained from making notes in the little Holloway. Dashed nonsense, they stopped because someone climbed the wall. From Colonel Pembroke. Couldn't have been after 8. I was marking essays then. From Simon Carter. I was in the kitchen all morning. Never saw a soul. From Clara Whitfield. Fascinating, murmured Dr. Briggs, polishing his spectacles. Quite fascinating. Miss Marple said nothing, her needles clicking softly. The vicar raised his hands. Please, please. One at a time. Perhaps we had better establish where everyone was between, say, 7 and 8 this morning. That being, we think, when the thing occurred. Colonel Pembroke drew himself up. I was at home, shaving. My man Wilkes will confirm it. Heard the news from the postman at 8:30. Mrs. Holloway nodded vigorously. I was out for milk at 8 sharp, as I told everyone, and saw the footprints myself. Went straight to the grocer's after Simon Carter cleared his throat. I, was at the schoolhouse, marking essays. 3rd form history, very dull. Didn't stir out till chapel bell rang the quarter hour. All eyes turned to Clara Whitfield, who set down the tray with a faint clink. Baking bread, same as every morning. Stove needed more wood, so I went out to the shed once or twice. Didn't see anyone near the study. Dr. Briggs, looking rather pleased at being consulted, said, House calls in the morning, as usual. Saw young Tommy Ellis about his cough at 7:30, then back home to write up notes. Miss Marple glanced up briefly. So no one admits to being near the study between 7 and 8. There was a little silence. Mrs. Holloway sniffed. Certainly not I, though it seems to me Clara here had the easiest access. Clara flushed. I've keys to half the cupboards in this house, Mrs. Holloway. Doesn't mean I go about stealing lockets. Ladies, murmured Dr. Briggs soothingly. Let's not jump to conclusions. Colonel Pembroke harumphed. Dashed silly business, if you ask me. Someone wanted a fell. This suggestion produced a gratifying murmur of interest. Mrs. Holloway looked scandalized at the idea of an overnight burglar lurking about. Clara stiffened. Dr. Briggs stroked his chin thoughtfully. Miss Marple's needles clicked serenely on. The vicar coughed. Well, thank you all. Perhaps we should let the constable take statements. In the meantime, any small observations may be useful. At this, everyone began producing theories like rabbits from a hat. Mrs. Holloway insisted she had glimpsed a shadow near the churchyard at dawn. Colonel Pembroke declared it must have been a fox. He had seen tracks near his hen house. Simon Carter remembered hearing a creak about 7:30, though it might have been the wind. Clara mentioned finding the kitchen door unlatched. Dr. Briggs thought he recalled a smell of tobacco in the study yesterday, which was odd since the vicar didn't smoke. Each clue seemed promising for about 30 seconds, before collapsing under its own vagueness. Miss Marple, listening, felt rather as she did when sorting her button box. So many bright possibilities, but only a few would prove to match. It was during the general chatter that she noticed 3 small things. First, that Mrs. Holloway, in recounting her morning, kept smoothing the handle of her handbag in a nervous little motion quite at odds with her usual brashness. Second, that Simon Carter, though protesting he had stayed in the schoolhouse, wore boots with a faint dusting of snow about the edges, as though he had been out, briefly, after all. And third, that Clara, the maid, practical soul though she was, had not met anyone's eye when she spoke of the kitchen door. Little things hardly worth mentioning. Yet Miss Marple believed in little things. People revealed themselves, she maintained, not in grand gestures but in the tiny details they overlooked. The meeting broke up after half an hour of inconclusive discussion. Colonel Pembroke stomped off, muttering about ropes and walls. Mrs. Holloway departed with her handbag and her theories. Simon Carter scuttled back to his essays. Villagers. Soon, even the famous footprints to the well were faint ghosts of themselves, as though the mystery wished to vanish as completely as the thief who had made them. Miss Marple, however, believed in getting ahead of snowstorms and of mysteries. She left her little house on Old Mill Lane just after 3, wrapped in a brown tweed coat and her favorite blue woolen scarf, the one she had knitted herself last winter. The air bit at her cheeks, but she walked with a steady, unhurried step toward the village square, a basket looped over one arm as though she were out on nothing more exciting than an errand for sugar. She began at the grocer's, naturally. Villages, Miss Marple often said, ran on gossip much as motor cars ran on petrol. A wise person knew to fill the tank often. Mrs. Pritchard, the grocer's wife, was in her usual place behind the counter, cheeks pink from the fire in the back room. She brightened at sight of Miss Marple, for Mrs. Pritchard considered the elderly lady a first-rate audience for news. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? They say the constable's coming from Much Benham tomorrow about the locket. My Bert says it was tramps, but I told him, 'Bert, no tramp stops to polish his boots neat as you please before vanishing into thin air.' That's what I told him." Miss Marple accepted her packet of sugar and murmured something agreeable, all the while noting 2 things. First, that Mrs. Pritchard dearly loved the sound of her own opinions, and second, that the shop window gave a clear view across the square to the vicarage gate. "Terrible business," Mrs. Pritchard went on. "And them saying Clara might have left the kitchen door open. I told Mrs. Holloway, I said, 'You mark my words, it's never the ones you suspect. Always the quiet sort with no alibi.'" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, my dear Mrs. Pritchard, that is very often the case. Though sometimes, you know, the quiet ones are only quiet because no one listens carefully enough." Mrs. Pritchard looked momentarily puzzled, then remembered she had more news about Mrs. Holloway's rheumatism and launched into it with gusto. Miss Marple left soon after, for she had no time to waste. Her neck over the kitchen with quiet interest. A large loaf of dough sat on the table, not yet risen. Boots stood drying by the hearth. A keyring hung on the wall beside the pantry door. 6 keys in all, each neatly labeled in Clara's careful handwriting. "The study key?" Miss Marple asked mildly, as though the thought had only just occurred to her. "Always hung there," Clara said promptly. "Never taken down unless I'm dusting in there. which I didn't this morning. You can ask the vicar himself." Miss Marple only smiled and sipped her tea. She had learned long ago that people revealed far more when one listened than when one interrogated. Clara's tone had carried no guilt, but there was a faint defensiveness in it, like a door slammed perhaps half a second too quickly. She stayed only a quarter of an hour listening to Clara talk about the bread, the boiler that wouldn't draw properly, and the hens refusing to lay in the cold. When Miss Marple left, she knew 3 useful things. The study key had not been out of Clara's sight yesterday. The kitchen door sometimes stuck in frost and had to be banged shut. And Clara herself was fond of romance magazines, 3 of which lay tucked beside the bread tin. None of it solved the mystery, but Miss Marple tucked it away in her mind as neatly as she did her knitting needles. One never knew which thread might prove important later. From the vicarage she crossed the square to the schoolhouse. The short winter day was already dimming. Lights glowed behind the frosted windows where Simon Carter sat at his desk correcting papers. He looked up with a start when Miss Marple tapped on the door. "Oh, Miss Marple. I thought everyone had gone home." She smiled pleasantly. "I was passing and wondered how you were getting on after this morning's excitement." Simon pushed his spectacles up his nose. "Oh, yes, quite. Dreadful thing about the locket. I suppose they'll find who did it soon enough." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "You were here marking papers all morning, I believe you said?" "Yes, well, most of it. I did pop out once to post had been seen chopping wood behind his cottage around 8. Mrs. Holloway claimed she had gone straight home after fetching milk. Simon admitted to leaving the school briefly. Clara swore the keys hadn't moved. Dr. Briggs, according to his housekeeper, had been writing letters until 9. Alibis everywhere, and yet the locket was gone. The footprints stopped at the well, and someone in St. Mary Mead was not telling the truth. As she reached her gate, Miss Marple noticed something half buried in the snow beside the hedge. A child's red mitten, small, sodden, dropped perhaps yesterday. A trivial thing. Yet she paused, looking at it for a long moment before carrying it to her garden wall and setting it there where its owner might see. Because life, Miss Marple reflected, was full of small dropped things. A mitten, a key, a careless word that told stories if one only knew how to read them. Inside she lit her fire, made herself a simple supper, and took up her knitting once more. Her mind ticked over the day's conversations as steadily as her needles clicked through the pale blue wool. Someone in the village had taken that locket. Someone knew more about those vanishing footprints than they had admitted. And Miss Marple, though she would never have put it so bluntly, intended to find out who before the week was out. Chapter 4. Red Herrings in the Snow. The next morning dawned bright and brittle, the snow lying thick and unyielding beneath a pale winter sun. Chimneys smoked against a sky so clear it looked almost false, like a backdrop on a stage. St. Mary Mead, usually a picture of serenity, stirred with unusual energy. For in a village, a mystery acts rather like yeast in warm dough. It rises swiftly, bubbles over, and sets everyone in motion whether they wish it or not. By breakfast time, half a dozen new theories about the missing locket and the vanishing footprints had already circulated, each more elaborate than the last. Miss Marple, buttering her toast at the neat table by her kitchen window, heard them all from her neighbor, Mrs. Hartnell, who popped in on the pretext of returning a borrowed gardening catalog. Mrs. Hartnell was a thick marmalade, which was accepted with the air of a woman gathering strength for further revelations. Of course, Mrs. Hartnell went on. Mrs. Pritchard insists the vicarage maid left the kitchen door unlocked, and that's how the thief slipped in. But then Clara swears she bolted it herself. And now Colonel Pembroke says he found rope ends by the church wall, though heaven knows what that proves. Miss Marple, spreading marmalade with delicate precision, said mildly, "Rope often proves nothing more than someone tied something up and later cut it down." Mrs. Hartnell looked faintly disappointed by this lack of drama. She preferred her mysteries with sinister meanings attached to every scrap of evidence. When she left at last, full of tea and importance, Miss Marple tidied her breakfast things and set out for the village. She believed in observing people while they still thought no one was watching closely. Human nature, she often said, showed itself most clearly before it realized it was on display. The square buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Colonel Pembroke stood outside the post office expounding his rope theory to anyone who would listen. "Plain as daylight," he declared, mustache bristling. "Fellow climbs the wall, pulls the rope up after him. Explains the footprints stopping, eh? Army training. Could have told you that yesterday." Mrs. Halloway, stout and indignant, interrupted. "Then why, Colonel, did no one see him come down the other side?" "The lane was as empty as my larder on Monday afternoons." "Could have slipped away before the snow cleared," said the Colonel, though without much conviction. Miss Marple paused beside them, smiling pleasantly. "And yet," she said, "if he climbed up and pulled the rope after him, there ought to be marks on top of the wall where he scrambled over. Were there?" The Colonel coughed. "Bit of snow displaced, perhaps. Hard to tell." "Ah," said Miss Marple gently. "Hard to tell often means not there at all in my experience." Mrs. Holloway gave a triumphant sniff, as though this settled the matter in her favor, though precisely what her favor was remained unclear. Meanwhile, Simon Carter hurried witnesses, each certain of their bit, like people squabbling over pieces of a jigsaw without the picture on the box. By midday, the constable from Much Benham had arrived, a slow-moving man with a notebook and a puzzled frown. He listened to everyone, wrote down everything, and departed looking more bewildered than when he came. It was after his visit that Miss Marple, strolling past the vicarage, found Clara Whitfield shaking a rug out of the scullery window. "Terrible fuss," Clara said, brushing snow from her apron. Half the village traipsing through the house, peering at cupboards as though the locket might sprout legs and come trotting out. Miss Marple smiled. "People do like a mystery. Makes them feel important." Clara hesitated, then said, "Mrs. Halloway told the constable she saw someone near the kitchen door at 7:30. Wearing a coat like mine, she said. As if I'd be creeping about stealing things before breakfast." Miss Marple made a soothing noise. "People often see what they expect to see." "Did you happen to be near the door at that time?" "Went out for wood, same as always," Clara admitted. "But I didn't go near the study. The vicar locks it every night himself." Miss Marple nodded, eyes kind. "Locks are curious things, though. I once knew a case where the lady swore her cupboard key had never left the hook, and yet her nephew had taken impressions in wax while it hung there quite safely." Clara looked startled. "Wax?" "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple serenely. "Quite a simple trick, really." She let the words hang like snowflakes in the air before changing the subject to hens and their refusal to lay. After leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked by the churchyard, where the famous footprints had first appeared. New snow had blurred them now into mere dimples, but she noticed something others had not. A few yards from the well lay a scrap of paper half buried in slush. She stooped, retrieved it, and found it to be part of a letter, the ink blurred but one phrase still legible. Owing money by Friday, or her way. By evening, the village buzzed with suspicion, like a hive stirred by a careless hand. Colonel Pembroke declared it an outside job. Mrs. Holloway hinted darkly about Clara's apron pockets. Simon Carter grew pale and silent whenever anyone mentioned the schoolhouse. Dr. Briggs remained genial but asked curious questions about the study window catches. And through it all, Miss Marple moved serenely, gathering fragments others discarded. A letter scrap here, a smudge of ash on Dr. Briggs's cuff there, Simon's damp boots, Clara's unrisen bread, Mrs. Holloway's nervous hands on her handbag clasp. By bedtime, St. Mary Mead had produced so many theories that the truth, whatever it was, lay buried beneath them like a coin dropped in deep snow. But Miss Marple, sitting by her fire with her knitting and her thoughts, believed the snow would not cover it forever. Human nature, she reflected, was like spring bulbs under frozen ground. However long the winter, it always came up in the end. Chapter 5. Shadows Behind the Snow. The third morning after the theft dawned with a dull pewter sky and the promise of more snow before evening. In St. Mary Mead, people had ceased pretending this was an ordinary week. The talk of rationing, poultry feed, and the price of butter now shared space with speculation about locks, footprints, and secret letters. Miss Marple, stirring sugar into her morning tea, listened to the church bells mark 8 o'clock and reflected that mysteries, like illnesses, tended to run their course in stages. First came excitement, then suspicion, then, if left unchecked, feverish invention. At present, the village suffered a raging temperature of theories. She decided it was time for a little gentle cooling. After breakfast, she walked toward the vicarage under a low sky heavy with unfallen snow. The air smelled of smoke and damp wool. A flock of starlings chattered in the bare sycamores near the church. The vicar himself, Reverend Finch, met her at the door with a harassed expression and ink on his fingers. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, ushering her in, "I'm at my wit's end. People inquiring at all hours whether I've found the wretched thing in my bread bin or under the hymnals. And poor Clara nearly in tears after Mrs. Holloway hinted about opportunities for temptation." Miss Marple removed her gloves calmly. "I wonder, Mr. Finch, if I might have a word in your study. Purely about household arrangements, of course." Looking puzzled, he led her into the small book-lined room, where the locked drawer still sat reproachfully in the desk. Miss Marple settled herself in a chair and said mildly, "I understand you always keep the study key on the ring in the kitchen." "Yes, indeed. Never off it except when I'm here." "And you lock the drawer each night?" "Without fail." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she took out a small square of knitting. "Then you may find it interesting that I once knew a case where a started slightly at sight of her. "Oh, Miss Marple. Another inquiry about the locket?" "Not at all," she said pleasantly. "I came to ask whether you might help me with the church jumble sale posters next week. Your handwriting is so clear." Relief flickered across his features. "Oh, certainly. Glad to. As they spoke, Miss Marple's gaze wandered over the classroom. Neat desks, chalkboard sums, a pair of galoshes drying by the stove. Ordinary things in an ordinary room, yet people's lives often left traces as faint as chalk dust if one looked closely enough. "Busy morning?" she asked lightly. "Marking compositions mostly." "Ah, yes. Such interesting glimpses of character, school essays. I remember once a boy confessed to stealing pears in the course of describing my summer holiday. Teachers must learn quite a lot reading between the lines." Simon smiled thinly. "Sometimes." Miss Marple took her leave soon after, having learned nothing definite except that Simon grew nervous whenever conversation strayed near the subject of truth-telling. She walked next to the Blue Boar Inn, where Mrs. Holloway now held daily tea sessions thick with rumor. Today's version featured a tramp hiding in the church belfry, descending by rope at dawn, and escaping toward Much Benham disguised as a milkman. Miss Marple sipped her tea serenely and asked whether anyone had actually seen this milkman. Mrs. Holloway admitted no one had. "Curious," murmured Miss Marple, "because the only milkman yesterday morning was young Fred Pritchard, and he was delivering to my cottage at 7:30, quite as usual." This quenched the belfry theory rather neatly, though Mrs. Holloway rallied with a suggestion about secret tunnels under the vicarage. Miss Marple only smiled. People did love their melodrama. On her way out, she encountered Dr. Briggs, tall and genial in his well-brushed overcoat. "Morning, Miss Marple. I hear we're now blaming tramps and belfries. Next it'll be ghosts." "Perhaps," she said mildly. "You were writing letters that morning, I understand." "Indeed. Patience, supplies, that sort of thing." "Why?" Miss Marple only smiled again. "Because strangers had been through the village recently." "Only that book salesman last week," Clara said. "Left pamphlets no one wanted and caught the bus to Upminster." "Why?" "Curiosity," said Miss Marple, though her thoughts were already spinning like snowflakes in wind. That evening the constable returned, no wiser than before, to announce there were still no suspects. Villagers gathered at the inn fire afterward, voices rising in anxious speculation. Colonel Pembroke insisted on burglars. Mrs. Holloway hinted at Clara. Someone else muttered about Simon Carter's money troubles last autumn. Through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly knitting, hearing more than people realized. Half-spoken quarrels, guilty hesitations, defensive laughter. When she finally walked home under the gas lamps, snow deep on the lane, she carried with her 3 small but solid facts among all the rumors. Someone had taken an impression of that study key. Someone had a letter mentioning money due by Friday. And someone in St. Mary Mead was growing increasingly nervous each time Miss Marple appeared. She suspected that before the week ended the snow would melt enough to show what lay beneath. By Thursday morning the snow lay thick as icing on a cake, covering the hedges, smoothing the roofs into gentle curves, and burying all but the most determined footprints along the lanes. A thin winter sun sparkled over St. Mary Mead, making the village look almost like a Christmas card, charming, peaceful, innocent. Miss Marple, standing at her cottage window with her knitting needles paused mid-row, reflected that appearances were often precisely the opposite of truth. Beneath all this brightness and quiet, uneasiness curled like smoke under a door. The constable had announced yesterday that investigations were ongoing, and then gone away again, leaving the village to its own devices. Villagers did not like being left to their own devices where mysteries were concerned. They made theories instead, spinning them out as busily as Miss Marple spun her knitting wool. This morning's theory, carried to Miss Marple by the postmistress while handing over her letters, concerned a traveling photographer who had once taken pictures at the fete 2 summers ago. He had a Morning, Miss Marple. I've had people in and out all day wanting to see the famous study, as if it were a picture gallery. Poor Mr. Finch says he can't think straight with everyone poking about. Miss Marple sympathized, then inquired mildly whether Clara had baked yesterday. No time, said Clara. Between visitors and that wretched boiler, I hardly sat down. Miss Marple only nodded, her eyes drifting again toward the keyring by the door. The smear beneath the study key had grown fainter, but was still there, a faint, waxy shine against the wood. She left soon after, strolling toward the schoolhouse where Simon Carter taught arithmetic to restless village children. The young man looked up nervously when she appeared at the door during his break. "Oh, Miss Marple, come in." "Thank you, but only for a moment." Her gaze wandered over the desks, the blackboard, the pile of compositions waiting to be marked. "You must be busy with lessons." "Always," he said shortly. Miss Marple smiled. "So fortunate you have that little break mid-morning. Time for letters, perhaps?" He blinked. "Letters? One must keep up with family, birthdays, and so on." A faint flush rose in his cheeks. "Oh, yes, well, quite." Miss Marple changed the subject at once, chatting about weather and school plays, leaving behind a young man looking as though he had swallowed something sharp. From the schoolhouse, she walked toward Dr. Briggs's surgery. The doctor greeted her cheerfully, brushing ash from his sleeve. Always ash, Miss Marple noticed, though she had never actually seen him smoke. They discussed the Scouts' Christmas plans before Miss Marple remarked, "You must write so many letters, Doctor. Suppliers, patients. Quite a correspondence, I imagine." He shrugged. "Part of the job." "Why?" Miss Marple only smiled. "One never knows what letters may reveal. People often keep things they ought to burn." For just a fraction of a second, his eyes flickered toward the grate where ashes lay gray and soft. Then he laughed, too loudly, and changed the subject to cough remedies. By noon, snow began falling again. Someone everyone knows. Mrs. Holloway looked scandalized. "You don't mean one of us?" Miss Marple only smiled and asked whether anyone wanted another scone. That afternoon, as the snow thickened to a white curtain, Miss Marple walked home by way of the churchyard. There, near the wall where footprints had famously ended days ago, she noticed something new. A scrap of blue wool caught on a bramble just above snow level. She plucked it free. Wool, fine, soft, almost the same shade as the scarf she herself wore. Someone else in the village then owned such a scarf, or a pair of gloves, or perhaps even a cap. And above the wall, on the coping stones themselves where no one had bothered to look closely after the first day, faint scratches marked the stone as though something metal had dragged across, something like a buckle or a boot edge. Miss Marple stood very still in the falling snow, considering. The rope story had been nonsense. No one could have climbed here without leaving deeper marks in snow on both sides. But someone had climbed, or dropped, something small enough to escape notice until now. She walked on slowly, her eyes narrowed against the white glare, pieces shifting in her mind like a jigsaw coming together. The wax smear under the key, the letter scrap about money, Simon's nerves, Clara's insistence on locked doors, Dr. Briggs' burning letters, the blue wool, the scratches on stone. That evening, by her fire, Miss Marple spread a fresh handkerchief on her lap and laid the scrap of wool and the half-burned letter upon it. People always thought clues meant fingerprints, footprints, revolvers in desk drawers. Nonsense. Real clues were scraps of wool, smears of wax, lies people told without knowing why. She remembered once solving a theft at a summer garden party because someone had taken cake with the wrong hand while pretending innocence. Human nature, she reflected, gave itself away in the smallest things. Outside, snow fell thick and silent. Inside, Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as though nothing whatever were happening. But in her mind, the pattern had begun. People were beginning to look at one another with furtive eyes. Miss Marple, arranging her hat before the mirror, reflected that guilt always rippled outward like a stone dropped into a still pond. Even when the guilty person smiled and chatted and fetched coal as though nothing were amiss, the ripples touched everything eventually. She decided it was time to watch the ripples very carefully indeed. Her first call that morning was at the vicarage, where Clara Whitfield was scrubbing the front steps with unnecessary vigor. "Morning, Miss Marple," Clara said, pushing back a wisp of hair with a soapy wrist. "If one more person comes poking about this house asking whether we've found that dratted locket, I swear I shall throw a bucket of water at them." Miss Marple smiled gently. "A trying week, my dear. But you're certain the study key was never out of sight?" "Certain," Clara said firmly. Mr. Finch locked up as usual that night, and next morning the key was still on the ring. I dusted the study Monday afternoon, but I never opened the drawer. Wouldn't dream of it." Miss Marple murmured something sympathetic, watching Clara's face as she spoke. It was open, tired, exasperated, but not guilty. People who lied, Miss Marple knew, often tried to look either too innocent or not innocent enough. Clara simply looked like a woman longing for her household to be left in peace. Miss Marple left her with sponge cake recipes and no suspicion at all. Next, she walked to the schoolhouse, where Simon Carter was instructing his pupils in the mysteries of fractions. He dismissed them for lunch when Miss Marple appeared, visibly startled but trying not to show it. "Miss Marple, good morning." "I came to ask about posters for the jumble sale," she said pleasantly. "Oh, yes, of course, happy to help." Miss Marple set down her knitting bag and said mildly, "You must have been very busy last weekend, with essays and letters and so forth." Simon cleared his throat. "Quite, yes. I suppose you never left the school except for that one little errand to the post." He hesitated. "No," recommended a salve, and poured her tea from a pot on the stove. "So many letters you write, Doctor," she remarked conversationally. "I should be afraid of mislaying one among so many." "Burn most of them," he said cheerfully. "Clears the desk." Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on the fireplace where gray ashes lay deep. "A pity sometimes. Letters tell one so much about people." He laughed but stirred his tea with unnecessary vigor. Miss Marple watched the spoon whirl round and round, as though hoping the tea leaves might tell him whether she suspected anything. When she left, she carried with her two impressions: Simon Carter growing nervous, Dr. Briggs growing wary. At the Blue Boar Inn that afternoon, Mrs. Halloway held court as usual, surrounded by teapots and eager listeners. "I say it was Clara," she announced. "Who else had the chance?" Colonel Pembroke snorted. "Nonsense, madam. Outside job, man with a rope, up the wall, off across the fields. Said so from the beginning." "Rope leaves marks," Miss Marple said softly from her corner. "And none were found." The colonel frowned. Well, snow might have covered them. Then it would have covered the footprints, too, Miss Marple pointed out. The colonel harumphed into his mustache. Mrs. Halloway leaned forward, eyes bright. You mean you suspect someone here, Miss Marple? Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly. I mean only that crimes are rarely so romantic as people wish. In my experience, they are usually committed by someone quite dull and ordinary. This produced an uneasy silence. No one liked to think the culprit might be drinking tea beside them, rather than lurking in a belfry with a rope and a dark lantern. By the time Miss Marple walked home under a crimson sunset, she had spoken to everyone she wished and gathered more than most people realized. Simon Carter's story about his movements did not quite match what others had seen. Dr. Briggs burned letters too readily for a man with nothing to hide. Colonel Pembroke clung to his rope have looked idyllic, untouched by any sort of crime. But inside parlors and at shop counters the air fairly crackled with suspicion. Miss Marple, finishing her porridge with quiet thoroughness, reflected that people grew uneasy when mysteries lingered too long. They liked things solved neatly, like crosswords in the Saturday paper. A crime left dangling made tempers short and tongues loose. She tied her bonnet strings, took up her knitting bag, and set out into the brittle morning. The first sign of frayed tempers came at the post office, where Mrs. Halloway and Colonel Pembroke were already engaged in heated argument. I tell you, Mrs. Halloway insisted, the fellow who came mending the telephone lines in September looked sly. Sly as a weasel. Madam, the colonel thundered, if you fling about accusations at random, we shall have the whole parish in the dock before Sunday. Miss Marple slipped in behind them to buy stamps, listening with mild interest. It's not random, Mrs. Halloway retorted. People who mend telephones always know too much about houses. People who talk nonsense, growled the colonel, ought to know better about wasting police time. Miss Marple paid for her stamps, dropped a gentle remark about the weather, and left them still wrangling fiercely enough to drown out the jangle of the shop bell. At the schoolhouse, Simon Carter looked worse than ever. Pale under his spectacles, ink smudged on his fingers. The pupils had gone home for the weekend, leaving silence heavy in the room. You're working too hard, Miss Marple said kindly, noting the stack of papers beside him. He jumped slightly. Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in. One rarely hears snow, she said. He tried to smile, failed, and pushed the papers into a drawer. Just essays. Dreadful handwriting. Most of them Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the scarf hanging on the peg by the door. A scarf of fine blue wool, frayed slightly at one edge. She moved toward it as though admiring the coat hooks. So hard to keep wool from catching on brambles, she murmured. Works too hard, Clara said. But he was at the school all that Sunday morning. Everyone knows that Miss Marple only nodded, turning the cup in her hands. And yet, she said mildly, footprints leading to the church wall vanished that day, did they not? Clara looked blank. I suppose so. The constable said as much. Miss Marple let the subject drop, and instead inquired about the new boiler. People told you far more, she reflected, when you seemed to care about things like boilers rather than lockets. At the Blue Boar Inn that afternoon, gossip fizzed like cider. Mark my words, Mrs. Halloway declared. The colonel knows more than he admits. Ex-army men always have secrets. The colonel snorted into his beer. "Madam, if I knew anything, the villain would already be clapped in irons." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Halloway darkly, "you're protecting someone." The colonel nearly choked. Miss Marple, sipping tea by the fire, observed them all with mild blue eyes. People talked so much when they were nervous. It saved her the trouble of asking direct questions. Later, as twilight crept across the snow, Miss Marple walked home by way of the churchyard. The wall where the footprints had ended loomed dark against the whiteness. She paused, peering closely at the coping stones. The scratches she had noticed days ago were clearer now where snow had melted. Someone had climbed here, or dropped something over. The marks were sharp, recent. She bent lower, examining the ground beyond the wall where drifts had thinned. Something gleamed faintly among frozen leaves. Miss Marple poked it free with her umbrella tip. A button, small, dark, with a trace of blue thread still clinging. She wrapped it carefully in her handkerchief. Blue thread, blue wool, blue scarf. Miss Marple stood very still, the winter wind tugging at her veil. At last she turned toward home, footsteps crunching in the snow. The picture was almost complete now. Only one or two tiny pieces remained before the whole thing would stand out as clear as a map, as though nothing at all were happening. Tomorrow would bring the truth into the open, at last. Chapter 9. The Truth in the Snow. Sunday afternoon brought pale sunlight across the village, glinting on the white roofs and frozen hedges like a blessing over the scene. But inside the vicarage drawing room, warmth and tension mingled uneasily as the villagers gathered at Miss Marple's invitation. The fire crackled cheerfully. Teacups rattled faintly as Clara Whitfield poured with trembling hands. Colonel Pembroke stood squarely on the hearthrug like a man preparing for battle. Mrs. Holloway sat forward in eager anticipation, certain at last she would hear something worth repeating to the entire county. Simon Carter hovered near the window, looking pale and drawn. Dr. Briggs leaned against the mantel, arms folded, face carefully neutral. Miss Marple herself sat in a corner chair, knitting as calmly as though this were an ordinary Sunday tea, and not, in fact, the unmasking of a village thief. "Thank you all for coming," she said pleasantly, clicking her needles. "I thought it might be best to settle this matter among ourselves, rather than let it drag on through the snow and gossip." "About time, too," grumbled Colonel Pembroke. Mrs. Holloway leaned forward. "You know who did it, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled vaguely. "Oh, yes. But perhaps we had better review the facts first. So tiresome when people complain afterwards that things weren't properly explained." She laid down her knitting and folded her hands. "On Sunday morning," she began, "the old Whitfield locket vanished from the vicar's study. The door was locked, the key on its ring by the kitchen door. The window was fastened, no footprints led away, except those ending by the churchyard wall." "Man with a rope," muttered the colonel. Miss Marple smiled. "That was one theory. Unfortunately, no rope marks existed on the coping." "Children." "But Simon Carter said he stayed at the school the whole time except for posting a letter." The postmistress, however, recalled he did not arrive until nearly noon, leaving, as she put it, plenty of time for walks elsewhere. Simon opened his mouth, closed it again. Miss Marple went on gently, as though she had not noticed. Meanwhile, Dr. Briggs burned a surprising number of letters that week, though of course doctors do receive many notes about tiresome things like fees. And Colonel Pembroke insisted on a daring burglar with a rope, which would have made an excellent story, but no sense whatever of the facts. The colonel colored deeply and blew his nose. Then, said Miss Marple, there was the matter of the footprints ending by the churchyard wall. Most people looked at the snow on the ground. Few looked at the wall itself. I did, and found not only scratches on the stone, but a scrap of blue wool caught on a bramble there. Her eyes rested briefly on Simon's blue scarf hanging by the door. Yesterday, she continued, I found a button in the snow beyond the wall. Dark horn, with a trace of blue thread still attached. I have it here. She held it up in her handkerchief. Matches the buttons on your overcoat, Mr. Carter. Simon made a choking sound. Lots of people have blue buttons. Indeed, Miss Marple said gently. But only you had both opportunity and need. That half-burned letter spoke of money trouble. Everyone knows you send money to your widowed sister. A very worthy cause. But desperate people sometimes take desperate steps. He had gone white to the lips now. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost apologetic. You climbed the wall to make it seem an outsider had escaped that way. You used the study key after pressing it into warm wax to take an impression, so it could be copied later, and no one the wiser. But you dropped a button jumping down, and your scarf caught on the bramble. Very careless indeed. For a moment there was only the hiss of the fire. Then Simon Carter gave a long, shuddering sigh. Yes, he said at once. And the vicar will decide what to tell the police. They are often kinder about such matters when things are restored promptly. The tension eased like air leaving a balloon. Clara fetched more tea, though her hands trembled. Mrs. Holloway whispered furiously to the colonel. Dr. Briggs lit a cigarette at last. Only Miss Marple seemed entirely unruffled, packing away her knitting as though solving crimes were as ordinary as finishing a row of stitches. Human nature, she said mildly into the hush. It does give itself away if one only watches long enough. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and the Last Word. Monday morning brought pale sunshine across the snowbound village, melting icicles from the vicarage eaves and turning the frozen road into a glittering ribbon. By mid-morning, the Whitfield locket lay once more in its velvet box on the vicar's desk, polished and gleaming as though it had never left. Simon Carter had indeed gone to the schoolhouse at first light and fetched it from beneath the loose floorboard in the coal cupboard, exactly as Miss Marple had said. No one had spoken much while he carried it back through the snow, head bent like a man walking behind his own coffin. At the vicarage, Reverend Finch had looked at him with grave eyes. The police, Simon? Simon had swallowed hard. If you believe it's best. But the vicar had sighed, turned the locket in his hand and said only, let us see first whether restitution and repentance can speak louder than punishment. So, for the moment, the matter rested in St. Mary Mead's own keeping. Miss Marple heard all this from Clara while accepting a second cup of tea in the Whitfield parlor. He looked so wretched, Clara said softly. I suppose it was the money. His sister with her children. I never knew things were so bad. People seldom advertise their difficulties, Miss Marple murmured. Pride runs deep, especially in quiet men. Clara sighed. I hope the vicar can keep the police out of it. Miss Marple said nothing. In her experience, authorities liked neat endings almost as much as villagers did. A confession, restitution, and a scolding from the vicar usually satisfied everyone involved, except perhaps clever after the fact. It did no harm, and it made them much less likely to ask inconvenient questions about how she herself had known so much. Later that day, Dr. Briggs called at her cottage with a jar of ointment for chilblains, which Miss Marple did not in the least require but accepted graciously. "A foolish business," the doctor said, setting down the jar. "Carter's a decent enough fellow. Bit weak, bit proud, that's all. Men hate admitting they can't manage." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and so very often they make things worse trying to put them right in secret." The doctor grunted agreement. "Finch says he won't press charges if the thing's returned and no more trouble made." "Good sense. No need to ruin the boy over one mistake." Miss Marple only smiled and offered seed cake, which the doctor accepted before hurrying off to patients genuinely in need of him. By evening, the whole affair had shrunk to the size village mysteries always shrank to once solved. A story to be told at intervals, until someone's cousin's wedding or a bad batch of marmalade provided fresher conversation. Life in St. Mary Mead returned to its familiar rhythm. School children trudging through snow with satchels swinging, the vicar writing sermons, Colonel Pembroke clearing paths with military precision, Mrs. Holloway telling everyone she had predicted it all. Only Simon Carter moved more quietly than before, like a man carrying something heavier than books under his arm. Miss Marple met him once outside the post office. "Thank you," he said awkwardly, eyes on the snow. "For not making it worse." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Perhaps next time, Mr. Carter, you will come to the vicar before coming to the coal cupboard." A faint, rueful smile touched his lips. "There won't be a next time." "I rather think not," said Miss Marple, and walked on. The following Sunday, the Whitfield locket hung once more around Clara's neck as the congregation filed into St. Mary Mead Church. Sunlight from the tall windows gleamed on its polished surface. After the service, people clustered. "Doubted you. Of course, said Miss Marple, eyes twinkling. The colonel coughed. "Still think it might have been a man with a rope, though." Miss Marple only smiled and asked whether he would take a cup of tea. And so the affair of the vanishing footsteps ended, as village mysteries always ended, with tea, gossip fading into legend, and Miss Marple knitting quietly by the fire, while life in St. Mary Mead went peacefully on. Because there was always another crime somewhere waiting to happen. Another little puzzle human nature would present. And when it did, Miss Marple would be there, mild and pink-cheeked, seeing everything while pretending to see nothing at all.